Welcome back, everyone, to our podcast. Let's jump right in. We're looking at a period of intense conflict and moral crisis from the Book of Mormon today.
Yes, a lot going on here.
Chapter 4 chronicles this really tumultuous period for the Nephites.
Absolutely.
Battles, sacrifices, escalating wickedness.
It's all there.
And it all starts with a battle.
Yep.
The Nephites, feeling confident in their strengths, they march into the land of desolation to fight the Lamanites.
Right.
But things don't quite go according to plan.
Yeah.
Verse 2 tells us, "And while they were yet weary, a fresh army of the Lamanites did come upon them, and they had a sore battle, insomuch that the Lamanites did take possession of the city desolation, and did slay many of the Nephites, and did take many prisoners."
The city of desolation, you see, it becomes a symbolic battleground, representing this struggle between righteousness and wickedness.
Yeah.
And its capture by the Lamanites signifies a shift in power, and it foreshadows the difficult times ahead.
And what's interesting is that the Nephites were the ones who initiated the conflict.
Well, that's a good point.
Their attack, driven by pride and a desire to control, ultimately gave the Lamanites the upper hand.
Right.
Verse 4 states, "And it was because the armies of the Nephites went up unto the Lamanites that they began to be smitten. For were it not for that, the Lamanites could have had no power over them."
Yeah, but this reminds us that even with good intentions, right?
Right.
Our actions can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Sometimes the best defense isn't a good offense, but rather humility and reliance on the Lord.
A tough lesson to learn, especially in the heat of battle.
Definitely.
But the struggle for desolation continues. Verses 6 through 8 describe a back-and-forth conflict.
Okay.
The Nephites managed to drive the Lamanites out and reclaim the city, but their victory is short-lived. And it came to pass that the Lamanites did make preparations to come against the city Tanchum. And it came to pass in the 364th year, the Lamanites did come against the city Tanchum, that they might take possession of the city Tanchum also. And it came to pass that they were repulsed and driven back by the Nephites. And when the Nephites saw that they had driven the Lamanites, they did again boast of their own strength, and they went forth in their own might, and took possession again of the city desolation.
So you notice how quickly the Nephites fall back into pride and self-reliance after a small victory?
Yeah.
Instead of giving thanks to God for their deliverance, they boast in their own strength. This sets the stage for further trials and tribulations.
And those trials come in full force in the following years as we move into the 366th year.
Right.
The violence escalates to horrific levels.
Yeah.
Verses 9 through 13 paint a chilling picture of the depravity that has gripped both the Nephites and the Lamanites. Let's take a look. "And now all these things had been done, and there had been thousands slain on both sides, both the Nephites and the Lamanites. And it came to pass that the 366th year had passed away, and the Lamanites came again upon the Nephites to battle. And yet the Nephites repented not of the evil they had done, but persisted in their wickedness continually. And it is impossible for the tongue to describe, or for man to write a perfect description of the horrible scene of the blood and carnage which was among the people, both of the Nephites and of the Lamanites. And every heart was hardened, so that they delighted in the shedding of blood continually. And there never had been so great wickedness among all the children of Lehi, nor even among all the house of Israel, according to the words of the Lord, as was among this people." It's a sobering reminder of how far we can fall when we turn away from God and allow our hearts to harden.
Yeah, the language used here in verse 11 is particularly striking.
Yeah.
That the author struggles to find words to describe the sheer brutality and depravity of the situation. Almost like they're saying, words cannot express the horror of what we are witnessing. This is the darkest point in our history.
And it gets even darker in a truly horrific act.
Right?
The Lamanites begin sacrificing Nephite women and children to their idols.
Oh, wow.
We see this described in verse 14. "And they did also march forward against the city Tanchum, and did drive the inhabitants forth out of her, and did take many prisoners, both women and children, and did offer them up as sacrifices unto their idol gods."
Imagine the pain and the terror these innocent victims must have experienced.
That's awful.
This act of barbarity shows the depths of depravity that humanity can sink to when it abandons God and embraces wickedness.
And the Nephites, fueled by anger and a desire for revenge, respond with equal brutality.
Oh, wow.
Verse 15 tells us, "And it came to pass that in the 367th year, the Nephites being angry because the Lamanites had sacrificed their women and their children, that they did go against the Lamanites with exceedingly great anger, insomuch that they did beat again the Lamanites and drive them out of their lands."
So it begs the question, was this response justified?
Right.
Or did it simply perpetuate the cycle of violence?
It's a really tough question.
It is.
On one hand, the Nephites' anger is completely understandable.
I get.
But on the other hand, their actions seem to mirror the very evil they are fighting against.
Exactly.
This highlights the danger of letting anger consume us.
Absolutely.
It can cloud our judgment and lead us down a path of destruction.
For sure.
It's a slippery slope, and it seems the Nephites are losing their footing. In the 375th year, a massive Lamanite army arrives, marking a turning point in the conflict.
Verses 16 and 17 describe this overwhelming force, and the Lamanites did not come again against the Nephites until the 375th year. And in this year, they did come down against the Nephites with all their powers, and they were not numbered because of the greatness of their number. It's like all the previous battles were mere skirmishes compared to this onslaught.
And from this point forward, the Nephites are on the defensive, constantly retreating and losing ground.
Exactly. Verse 18 paints a vivid picture of their decline. And from this time forth did the Nephites gain no power over the Lamanites, but began to be swept off by them, even as a dew before the sun.
Yeah.
This imagery of dew evaporating in the heat of the sun, it really conveys the sense of their helplessness and impending doom.
We see this play out as the Lamanites capture key cities like Desolation and Boaz.
Right.
Despite their valiant efforts, the Nephites are simply outnumbered and outmatched.
And sadly, throughout these battles, women and children continue to be the victims of senseless violence and sacrifice.
It's heartbreaking.
It's a heart-wrenching reminder of the innocent lives lost in the midst of conflict.
It's a bleak picture, and as the situation deteriorates, Mormon, who's been chronicling these events, makes a crucial decision.
Yes, in verse 23 we read, "And now I, Mormon, seeing that the Lamanites were about to overthrow the land, therefore I did go to the hill Shim, and did take up all the records which Amram had hid up unto the Lord."
He recognizes that his people are on the brink of destruction, and he acts to preserve their history for future generations. It's an act of faith and hope in the midst of despair.
It really is.
This chapter is incredibly rich with symbolism and spiritual insights. There's so much to unpack here.
Absolutely.
We'll continue exploring the themes of violence, pride, and the consequences of wickedness in just a moment.
Looking forward to it. You know, it's easy to distance ourselves from these events, to see them as ancient history that has no bearing on our lives today. But I think that would be a mistake.
Yeah.
The themes we see playing out in this chapter are timeless and universal.
I agree. Pride, anger, violence, these are human struggles that transcend time and culture. We see these same patterns playing out in conflicts and societies all around us.
That's right, even in our own lives.
Absolutely. Take, for example, the concept of the wicked being punished by the wicked. We see this principle illustrated in verse 5.
Right.
But behold, the judgments of God will overtake the wicked. And it is by the wicked that the wicked are punished. For it is the wicked that stir up the hearts of the children of men unto bloodshed. This verse reminds us that violence often begets violence, creating this vicious cycle that's hard to break.
Yeah.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we embrace wickedness and resort to violence, the more we create the conditions for further wickedness and bloodshed.
And it's not just physical violence that's concerning.
Right.
There's also a spiritual dimension to this wickedness, a hardening of hearts that makes people indifferent to suffering.
Yes. Remember how verse 11 describes the people delighting in bloodshed?
Yes.
And it is impossible for the tongue to describe or for man to write a perfect description of the horrible scene of the blood and carnage which was among the people, both of the Nephites and of the Lamanites. And every heart was hardened, so that they delighted in the shedding of blood continually. This is a chilling indication of how far they'd fallen morally.
Absolutely.
They've lost their sense of humanity, their capacity for empathy and compassion.
It's a stark reminder that wickedness can corrupt even those who once considered themselves righteous. The Nephites, despite their covenant relationship with God, allowed their hearts to be hardened by pride and anger. They lost sight of their divine mission and became consumed by worldly pursuits.
Yeah, their initial desire to defend their land and their people was noble. But somewhere along the way, they lost their way. Their pride and their desire for revenge blinded them to the truth.
And this is where the importance of repentance comes in throughout this chapter. There's a sense that if the Nephites had truly repented, if they had turned back to God with all their hearts, things might have turned out differently.
But instead, they persisted in their wickedness.
Yes.
Ultimately leading to their downfall.
Yeah.
It's a cautionary tale for all of us. reminding us to constantly examine our own hearts, to guard against pride and anger,
Absolutely.
and to seek forgiveness when we stray from the path of righteousness.
And it highlights the importance of seeking peace, even in the midst of conflict. The Nephites were so focused on winning the battle, on defeating their enemies, that they forgot the true meaning of victory.
What is the true meaning of victory?
True victory lies not in conquering others, but in conquering ourselves, in overcoming the darkness within us. It's about choosing compassion over anger, forgiveness over revenge, and humility over pride.
And ultimately, it's about relying on God's strength rather than our own intellect. The Nephites placed too much trust in their own power and their own wisdom, and they paid a heavy price for it.
It's true.
It's a lesson that we would do well to remember.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up our discussion of this chapter, I want to touch on one more point: the recurring theme of sacrificing women and children. It's a truly heartbreaking and disturbing aspect of this conflict.
Absolutely. It underscores the brutality of war and how it often victimizes the most innocent and vulnerable among us. These acts of barbarity are a stark reminder of the depths of depravity that humanity can sink to.
We see this in verse 14, where it describes the Lamanites sacrificing Nephite women and children to their idols. And they did also march forward against the city Teancum, and did drive the inhabitants forth out of her, and did take many prisoners, both women and children, and did offer them up as sacrifices unto their idol gods.
Right.
And again in verse 21 we read, and when they had come the second time, the Nephites were driven and slaughtered with an exceedingly great slaughter. Their women and their children were again sacrificed unto idols.
Terrible.
These verses are incredibly difficult to read. They force us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, the capacity for cruelty and violence that exists within us all.
And it's not just ancient history. We see these same atrocities happening in the world today. Innocent men, women, and children are being caught in the crossfire of conflict, becoming victims of violence, exploitation, and oppression.
It's a sobering reminder that war is never glorious, that it always leaves scars, both physical and emotional, on individuals, families, and entire societies.
Yeah, and it underscores the urgent need to work for peace, to strive for a world where such atrocities are never again committed.
Absolutely.
We must never become desensitized to the suffering of others,
Right.
but rather let it fuel our compassion and our determination to build a better world.
So as we reflect on this challenging chapter, let's ask ourselves some hard questions.
Okay.
What are we doing to promote peace in our own lives and in our communities? How are we responding to the suffering we see in the world around us?
Yeah.
Are we contributing to the cycle of violence, or are we working to break it?
These are questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. But one thing is clear, we cannot remain silent in the face of evil.
Right.
We must speak out against injustice, defend the vulnerable, and work tirelessly to create a world where peace and righteousness prevail.
And that begins with examining our own hearts, with rooting out the seeds of pride, anger, and hatred within ourselves. We must strive to be peacemakers, to be instruments of God's love and compassion in a world that desperately needs it.
So as we conclude our discussion of this chapter, I encourage you to ponder these things. Let the lessons of the past inform your present and inspire your future.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of a challenging chapter in the Book of Mormon. We hope this discussion has been insightful and thought-provoking.
We encourage you to continue pondering these principles and seek out further understanding through prayer and study.
And if you've enjoyed this conversation, we invite you to subscribe to our podcast for more discussions like this one. Until next time, may peace and goodness be with you.
You know, it's a heavy chapter for sure, but there is light to be found even in the darkness.
Right.
Mormon's choice to preserve the records shows us that even when all hope seems lost, we can still choose faith.
Absolutely. It's a powerful testament to the enduring power of hope and the importance of remembering our past, even the painful parts.
Right.
Those records hidden away would eventually become the Book of Mormon,
Right.
a source of guidance and inspiration for us today.
It really makes you think about what we're leaving behind for future generations. That's a good point.
What stories, what lessons will they learn from our choices?
Well, we have a responsibility to learn from the mistakes of those who came before us.
Yes.
To recognize those same patterns of pride, anger, and violence in our own lives and in the world around us.
Right.
And then to choose a different path.
I like that this chapter isn't just a historical account. It's a mirror reflecting our own potential for both good and evil.
Absolutely.
It's a call to examine our hearts and align ourselves with God's will.
The Nephites had blessings and covenants, just as many of us do.
Right.
Yet they allowed themselves to drift from righteousness ultimately facing those devastating consequences.
Yeah.
Like a cautionary tale about the importance of staying true to our principles and seeking God's guidance in all things.
Their downfall wasn't inevitable.
Right.
There were moments where they could have chosen differently.
Of course.
Repented and changed course.
Yeah.
That same power of choice exists for us today.
Yeah.
Every day we have the opportunity to turn towards light and goodness.
And that turning point often starts with humility, recognizing our own weaknesses and our need for God's grace.
Yeah.
The Nephites relied on their own strength and wisdom, and it ultimately failed them.
Right.
We must learn from their example and place our trust in the one who has the power to deliver us.
Yes. This chapter leaves us with a lot to ponder.
It really does.
The cyclical nature of violence, the destructive power of pride, the importance of repentance, and above all, the unwavering hope found in God's mercy and love.
It's a timeless message.
It is.
As relevant today as it was centuries ago.
Absolutely. We each have a role to play in building a more peaceful and righteous world.
We do.
Let's choose to be instruments of healing, compassion, and hope.
Well said.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of a challenging chapter in the Book of Mormon.
Yes, thank you.
We hope this discussion has been insightful and thought-provoking.
We encourage you to continue pondering these principles and seek out further understanding through prayer and study.
And if you've enjoyed this conversation, we invite you to subscribe to our podcast for more discussions like this one.